October of 1931. A bacteriologist named Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall stood before a meeting of the California Medical Research Society in Los Angeles and told a room of licensed physicians that he had watched terminal cancer patients recover, not improve, not stabilize, recover. He named the doctor responsible, he named the device, he named the mechanism. He had seen it with his own eyes in a clinical setting, under controlled conditions, documented by colleagues from the University of Southern California. He described what he had witnessed in the precise, measured language of a man with 30 years of laboratory experience. The room was silent for several seconds after he finished. By the following spring, Kendall had publicly reversed every word of that statement. He withdrew his endorsement. He distanced himself from the research. He retired from his position at Northwestern University Medical School without explanation and never practiced or published again. No disciplinary proceeding was recorded against him. No formal recantation was published. He simply stopped. The man who had stood before the California Medical Research Society and described watching cancer patients recover walked away from medicine entirely within 6 months of saying it. The doctor he had been describing was Royal Raymond Rife. The device was a frequency instrument of Rife's own design. The patent application Rife filed in 1931 covered the core operating mechanism of that instrument. By the spring of 1932, the American Medical Association had opened a file on Rife's laboratory. By 1939, the laboratory was gone. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Rife built, and why the American Medical Association moved against it with the speed and thoroughness that the record shows, we have to go back to where Rife started, and how far beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine he had travelled by the time his work attracted institutional attention. Royal Raymond Rife was born in Elkhart, Indiana in 1888. He was not a credentialed physician. He was an optical engineer and self-trained microbiologist who had spent years working in the laboratory of Dr. Frederick Lowell at Johns Hopkins before establishing his own research facility in San Diego in 1920. What distinguished Rife from the beginning was his approach to the microscope. The instruments available to researchers in 1920 had a resolution ceiling, a physical limit imposed by the wavelength of visible light, prevented the observation of organisms smaller than approximately 0.2 microns in diameter. Viruses at the time were essentially invisible to direct observation. They were inferred from their effects, not seen. Rife believed the resolution ceiling could be broken not by changing the light source, but by changing the way the light interacted with the specimen. He spent 11 years building, testing and rebuilding optical instruments before producing, in 1931, a microscope he called the universal microscope. The problem Rife was solving was not simply mechanical. Every microscopist of his era was working against the same physical constraint, a limit established in the 1870s by German physicist Ernst Abbe, who had mathematically demonstrated that no optical microscope could resolve objects smaller than half the wavelength of the light used to illuminate them. Visible light has a wavelength between roughly 400 and 700 nanometers. Bacteria range from 200 nanometers upward and can be seen. Viruses range from 20 to 300 nanometers, well below the Abbe limit for visible light. The implication of Abbe's limit, accepted by the scientific establishment as settled physics, was that viruses could never be directly observed through optical microscopy. Electron microscopy, which would eventually allow viral observation, did not become available for biological use until the late 1930s. In 1920, when Rife began his optical work, anyone claiming to see a virus was claiming to see something that physics said could not be seen. The scientific establishment's skepticism about Rife's instrument was not irrational. What was irrational was the refusal by institutions with the resources to investigate, to test the claim rather than simply dismiss it. The universal microscope had a resolution capacity that its builder claimed exceeded any instrument then in existence by a factor of approximately 30. It used a combination of polarized light, prisms, and a rotating stage that allowed specimens to be illuminated from multiple angles, simultaneously producing what Rife described as a condition under which the organism's own resonant frequency caused it to become visible through a form of light refraction that conventional microscopy had never exploited. The instrument contained 5,682 separate parts. It weighed approximately 200 pounds. It took Rife between 1 and 2 hours to calibrate for a new specimen. Once calibrated, it allowed the direct observation of living microorganisms at a scale that no other instrument of the period could approach. 3 independent investigators examined the universal microscope between 1931 and 1937 and confirmed its performance. Dr. Milbank Johnson, a prominent Los Angeles physician and member of the board of the University of Southern California, examined the instrument in 1931 and described it in a letter to a colleague as functioning exactly as Rife had claimed. Dr. Edward Rosenau of the Mayo Clinic visited Rife's laboratory in 1932 and published a formal statement confirming that he had observed microorganisms through the universal microscope at magnifications that exceeded the theoretical limits of conventional optical instruments. The third examination was conducted by a team from the Smithsonian Institution in 1944, years after Rife's laboratory had been dismantled, and resulted in a published account in the Smithsonian Annual Report that described the universal microscope in historical terms, as if it were an artifact of a closed chapter, rather than as a functioning instrument whose implications remained open. What Rife observed through the universal microscope was what he called the BX virus. The reaction of the men who examined the instrument in person is worth dwelling on. These were not fringe figures. Milbank Johnson served on the board of the University of Southern California and was a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. Edward Rosenau had been at the Mayo Clinic since 1915 and was one of the most respected bacteriologists in the country. Both men examined the instrument, observed specimens through it, and confirmed in writing that they had seen what Rife claimed they would see. Rosenau's 1932 statement was published in a scientific bulletin and entered the institutional record. It was not contested, it was not refuted, it was simply never followed up. An endorsement from a Mayo Clinic senior researcher confirming the performance of a revolutionary microscope generated no institutional response, no replication attempt, no funded investigation. The endorsement existed, was noted, and was ignored. He believed it to be a pleomorphic microorganism, one capable of changing its form, that was present in every cancer tissue sample he examined. He believed it was not merely associated with cancer, but causally responsible for it, and he believed he had found a way to destroy it without harming the surrounding tissue. The mechanism was frequency. Rife had been studying the relationship between electromagnetic frequency and microbial behavior since the early 1920s. Every living organism, he argued, has a resonant frequency, a specific oscillation at which its cellular structure is vulnerable to disruption. Apply the right frequency to a targeted organism with sufficient precision, and the organism's structure collapses. He called this the mortal oscillatory rate. It was in principle the same phenomenon that causes a crystal glass to shatter when a singer hits the right note, except applied at the microscopic scale to specific pathogens, with enough precision to destroy the target without affecting the surrounding tissue it inhabited. The 1931 patent application covered the frequency instrument Rife had built to deliver those targeted oscillations. It described the mechanism for identifying the mortal oscillatory rate of a given organism and the method of tuning the instrument to that frequency for therapeutic application. Rife did not file the patent casually. He filed it because the clinical results had reached a threshold that he believed warranted formal protection of the method. Those clinical results were documented in a study conducted between 1934 and 1935 at the Scripps Ranch estate of Dr. Milbank Johnson. 16 patients diagnosed with terminal cancer, all cases that had been certified as terminal by their treating physicians, were treated with Rife's frequency instrument under the supervision of a committee of physicians organized by the University of Southern California. After 90 days of treatment, 14 of the 16 patients were evaluated and declared clinically recovered. The remaining 2 required an additional 60 days of treatment, after which they were also declared recovered. The supervising committee submitted a formal report to the University of Southern California. That report has never been published. The university has never publicly acknowledged its existence. Dr. Milbank Johnson, who had organized and overseen the study, died in 1944 under circumstances his family described as unexpected. He had been in good health. He had been preparing, according to his personal correspondence, to publish the Scripps Ranch results. He died before the manuscript was completed. The 1931 patent application was received by the United States Patent Office. It was not approved, not rejected, and not returned. The fate of that application sits alongside 2 other medical patent cases from the same decade that followed an almost identical trajectory. Dr. William Frederick Koch, a Detroit physician, filed patent applications in the 1920s for a cancer treatment he called glyoxylide, which he claimed produced remission in cases that conventional medicine had certified as terminal. The AMA opened a file on Koch in 1925. By 1942, federal agents had raided his laboratory on fraud charges. The charges were brought twice. Both trials ended in hung juries. Koch eventually relocated to Brazil, where he continued his work until his death in 1967. His patent applications, like Reif's, entered the Patent Office review process and did not emerge with any recorded disposition. Max Gerson, a German-trained physician who had documented the regression of terminal cancer cases through a dietary and metabolic protocol, applied for institutional recognition of his treatment in the United States in the late 1940s. A United States Senate subcommittee held hearings on the Gerson therapy in 1946. The hearing transcript was published. It documented testimony from 5 of Gerson's recovered patients and from Gerson himself, presenting detailed clinical records. The subcommittee's report recommended further investigation. That recommendation was never acted upon. The AMA Journal published a dismissal of Gerson's work the same year. 3 researchers, 3 documented clinical claims, 3 patent or recognition applications that went nowhere, 1 institution present in all 3 cases. It entered the review process and did not emerge. No examiner's report was issued. No correspondence with the applicant was recorded. The application simply ceased to move. That status, received, acknowledged, permanently stalled, has not changed in 93 years. Dr. Arthur Kendall's reversal in the spring of 1932 was not the only institutional response to Reif's work during this period. Morris Fishbane, the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and one of the most powerful figures in American medicine between 1924 and 1949, became aware of Reif's laboratory no later than 1934. Fishbane sent a representative to San Diego to meet with Reif that year. The representative proposed a commercial arrangement under which the AMA would take a controlling financial interest in Reif's frequency instrument in exchange for institutional endorsement. Reif declined. Within 3 years of that meeting, the AMA had begun a systematic campaign to discredit Reif's findings in the pages of its own journal. The campaign did not engage with the clinical data. It did not commission independent replication of the Scripps Ranch study. It did not request access to the universal microscope for examination. What it did was methodical and effective in its own terms. Fishbane's journal published a series of articles between 1937 and 1939 that referenced Reif's work only to dismiss it, consistently describing the frequency instrument in language that implied obvious quackery without engaging the specific clinical claims. The articles did not cite the Scripps Ranch study. They did not mention Milbank Johnson or Edward Rosenau. They did not acknowledge that independent researchers with established credibility had personally examined the instrument and confirmed its performance. They wrote as though none of that had happened, and because the AMA Journal was the primary gatekeeping publication for American medical credibility in that era, the version of events they published became, by institutional default, the version that persisted. It did not request access to the universal microscope for examination by AMA-affiliated researchers. It attacked the credentials of Reif's supporters questioned the methodology of studies it had never examined, and published repeated editorial statements characterizing the frequency instrument as pseudoscientific without providing the scientific basis for that characterization. Fishbein's journal had the authority to define medical legitimacy in the United States in 1937. It used that authority not to investigate a clinical claim but to bury it. The American Medical Association has never adequately explained why no independent replication of the Scripps Ranch study was ever commissioned or funded, given that the study reported full remission in 16 terminal cancer patients. It has never explained why Morris Fishbein's 1934 meeting with Rife, and the commercial proposal reportedly made at that meeting, does not appear in any AMA institutional record, despite being described in detail in the personal correspondence of two individuals who were present. It has never explained why Arthur Kendall, a man with 30 years of laboratory experience and no prior history of public reversal on any professional matter, withdrew an eyewitness account he had delivered before a room of colleagues without issuing any explanation for the reversal. It has never explained why the 1931 patent application has remained in a permanent state of unresolved review for over 9 decades without a single examiner's notation. Why would an institution whose stated purpose was the advancement of medical science respond to a reported cure for terminal cancer not with investigation but with editorial suppression? Why would a man of Kendall's professional stature and reputation walk away from medicine entirely within 6 months of publicly endorsing research he had personally witnessed, with no explanation offered and none recorded? Why does the University of Southern California hold no record of a clinical study it officially supervised, conducted at the estate of one of its own board members, with results that, if accurate, would represent the most significant medical finding of the 20th century? Why would the Patent Office receive an application, acknowledge it, and then produce no record of any subsequent examination, correspondence or disposition for 93 years? These questions do not go away because institutions decline to answer them. The documented suppression is verifiable and specific, entirely independent of whether Rife's frequency instrument functioned as he claimed. That is not a theory, that is a series of concrete, provable gaps in the official record of American medicine that the official record has never once addressed. Rife spent the decade after 1939 attempting to rebuild. His primary laboratory in San Diego had been destroyed by fire, a fire that investigators at the time attributed to an electrical fault, that Rife's colleagues attributed to deliberate arson, and that nobody ever formally resolved. A second laboratory he established with a partner named John Crane in the 1950s was raided by federal agents in 1961. Crane was convicted of practicing Santan without a license and sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. Rife was not charged. He was 73 years old. He spent his remaining years in relative isolation, drinking heavily and declining interviews. He died in 1971 at the age of 83. The cause was a combination of alcohol and Valium. The doctor who treated him in his final days noted that Rife had spoken, in those last weeks, about the Scripps Ranch study with the clarity and precision of a man describing something that had happened recently, not 40 years before. He named the patients. He named the physicians who had been present. He described the condition of the 14 patients at the beginning of the 90-day treatment and their condition at the end. He knew what the results had been. He knew what had been done to them. He never stopped knowing. John Crane, Rife's laboratory partner, who had served 3 years in prison for their shared work, outlived Rife by nearly 30 years. He spent much of that time attempting to reconstruct Rife's research from surviving notes and to locate the original clinical documentation from the Scripps Ranch study. He found nothing. The documentation had not been archived. It had not been transferred. It had not been destroyed in any recorded event. It was simply not anywhere that Crane could reach. The universal microscope was last documented as functional in 1944. Its current location is unknown. Of the 2 complete units known to exist in 1939, neither has been publicly exhibited, examined by any scientific institution, or reported destroyed. The official history tells us that Royal Raymond Rife was a talented but misguided amateur whose claims could not be substantiated, whose instrument could not be independently verified, and whose clinical results were never replicated. What the documented record of physicians, institutions and correspondence tells us is that his instrument was independently verified by multiple credentialed observers, his clinical results were supervised by a university committee, and the institutional response to those results was not replication or refutation, but commercial proposition followed by systematic suppression. Those two accounts cannot both be true. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried, it disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects Maurice Fishbane's campaign against Rife directly to 3 other suppressed medical researchers from the same decade, a pattern that begins before Rife and continues well past him, involving the same journal, the same methods, and in 2 of the 3 cases, the same outcome.